Joining me right now, we have NBC News senior national security editor David Rohde and former member of the FBI's hostage rescue team and Sierra One Consulting founder, Rob D'Amico. Gentlemen, good to see you both. So, Rob, your reaction to this pick, I'm curious how it's being received inside the Bureau. What do you know about that?
There's actually a lot of turmoil inside the Bureau. I've been on a few Facebook pages of agents, former people, and I would say it's split. A lot of them like it because some of the people that were in the FBI or currently in the FBI thought it has been getting more political. And then there's some that are in there saying, like, wait a second, this is not the norm. This is someone that's Trump's going to be able to call, and the FBI's independence is going to go away. So I think it's and I think that relates to the bigger turmoil within the Bureau. And I think it came from actually under Mueller, where headquarters started taking a bigger percent of how the FBI did things. As before that, it was all in the field. And when you do that, when you bring it back to D.C., I think things get more political instead of the field offices running all the investigations. And I think you're seeing something that's been happening over years is now culminating.
Hey, but Rob, for those who are concerned that the FBI is becoming more political, in the last hour I spoke with Christopher O'Leary, who said the general consensus is, if anything, it has tilted to the right. Is that the direction that people are suggesting?
I think the Bureau has always been more conservative in that. People didn't talk politics when I came in, though. I don't recall anyone ever talking about politics in the office until the last days of the Bureau. And one of the people who politicized it the most, and it wasn't Trump, I mean, it wasn't Comey, it was under him, started bringing politics into it. And I think you saw that in some of the texts that came out on some of the investigations. People didn't talk about it before, but now it's being talked about more. But I do think the Bureau in general is more conservative and more Republican. But there is that other side that gets in there and says, but wait a second, we have to remain independent no matter what our political party is.
Keep
that's
politics out of it. Yeah. So, David, I want to read a quote from an article that you co-wrote, and it includes a quote from a former law enforcement official who worked with Patel. The official says, quote, "It is ridiculous. He's arguably the least qualified person ever nominated for a senior position in federal law enforcement. I don't know anything significant that he achieved at the DOJ. He was not well regarded as a prosecutor." What else are you hearing from law enforcement officials?
I would echo what Rob was saying, is that most people in the FBI don't talk politics and actually don't want to be involved in these kind of cases. I also wrote a lot about the Mar-a-Lago investigation, and there was huge hesitance among FBI agents about how to handle that case. It went on for a long time. Former President Trump at that point wouldn't return, dozens of classified documents. And there was division about whether to search Mar-a-Lago. It was eventually done and ordered by the FBI. But the main thing is a fear that Kash Patel sort of follows conspiracy theories, is going to come in. I mean, he's talked about closing the FBI headquarters in D.C., prosecuting people. And there's a concern that this type of politics, what it does most of all is distract the FBI from its main goals, which is cracking down on drug trafficking, violent crime across the U.S., and sort of guarding against foreign espionage in the United States. So people are tired of the politics on both sides inside the FBI is what I've heard, and they worry this is just going to be more infighting and more of a distraction.
Can I ask you just quickly to go back, since you brought it up and you wrote about it with Mar-a-Lago, was there a sense and acknowledgement that these classified documents had gone with Trump to Mar-a-Lago? And if that's the case, where was the consternation? Because did anyone think they should just stay with him?
There was a fear that searching Mar-a-Lago would play into his narrative that the FBI was some deep state cabal out to get Trump. There wasn't a debate about the facts, and it's a frustration inside the FBI with how hyper partisan our politics have become. And this, nomination is sort of the latest example of that.
So Patel, David, has spread baseless deep state conspiracy theories, including that federal bureaucrats tried to overthrow Trump from office. So talk about some of the dangerous falsehoods that Patel has promoted, and also his calls for retaliation against those that Trump sees as his enemies.
There is very, criticism, as Rob mentioned, of Director Comey, some of the things he did in office, the Trump-Russia investigation, how it began. But there was a nearly 4-year special counsel investigation by John Durham into the Comey era, what happened then, the Trump-Russia investigation. And there were no criminal charges brought against any senior officials. There was one lawyer who lied on a document that took a plea bargain, and 2 other people were brought to trial, pretty low-level people, and they were acquitted. So the scope of conspiracy that Trump also and Patel have alleged was not found by John Durham, a special counsel appointed by the Trump administration, who had, again, nearly 4 years to investigate all this, and he did not find the kind of conspiracies Trump Patel alleges.
So Rob, Patel said in a statement, if appointed, he will work to restore integrity, accountability, and equal justice to our justice system. Patel, however, has called for replacing anti-democratic officials in law enforcement and intelligence with patriots, and for a purge of perceived Trump enemies from the FBI. So what are your concerns about how he could reshape the agency?
Well, there's always concerns that you let a political person come in to quote reshape the agency, but there's also safeguards out there. There's the DIOG, how you can investigate internal to the United States, how you do investigations. There are attorney general guidelines that say how you can open an investigation, what you have to keep it going. Those can't be broken unless you have an attorney general rewrite those. So there's one thing to talk and say what you're going to do, but then to get in the bureaucracy of something like the FBI. I remember when Director Mueller came in after 9/11, he said the FBI's first primary responsibility is to prevent terrorist acts like 9/11. We even had agents then, because the culture was always a crime's committed, you investigate it, you bring it to court. We're saying, oh, he's going to be gone. That's just a fad. The Bureau is long. Like, I remember when I first got there, we didn't like the SAC, the special agent in charge, and the senior agent said, give it about a year and a half, he'll be gone, and we'll go on to the next one. That'll be more understanding. So it's one of those things that you can't change a bureaucracy very quickly. It is a slow-moving ship, and it has a lot of laws because of what happened under Hoover to prevent one person from dictating a lot.
Yeah. What are you hearing from lawmakers, David? Do you expect him to face an uphill battle during his nomination hearing? Confirmation.
I'm not sure what's going to happen. You know, I thought that what Senator Rounds said this morning, as Julie noted, was significant, pointing out I think Ray does have some support on Capitol Hill, but President Trump won this election, and, you know, it's up to, you know, the Senate. It's another test of the Senate's, you know, will they advise and consent? Will they act, you know, do a thorough review of every nominee? And this is another challenge. I think it's as significant as the Gates nomination. So we'll see what happens with the Senate, but I won't predict at this point.
Yeah. Well, that's smart, because it's hard to predict what they're going to do, particularly on this one. The FBI, Rob, issued a statement saying, in part, every day the men and women of the FBI continue to work to protect Americans from a growing array of threats. So if Patel becomes director and then follows through on his vows to fire senior leaders and prosecute agents, how might we see career FBI officials respond?
Well, you know, it's one of those things that, like, the career FBI agent is in the field, and they're doing the work that statement comes out and says. They're the ones out there investigating. I've never been a headquarters fan myself. I've been out front. I ran operations in Afghanistan in 2018 and 19, and I had almost 4 years in Afghanistan. I had headquarters people telling me, and only 1 out of maybe 30 had ever been to Afghanistan, how to run my ops in Afghanistan. And I just told them to get lost. So I hope it goes back to the field directs how investigations are going and headquarters supports. That's the way it should have been. That's the way it was when it was working well. And I don't know if one person can change all that, because it is tough to fire people, which it should be. But if someone's not doing things that they need to be doing, there has to be a way to get rid of them. So I'm not. It can go both ways, and it's going to be tough to see. But I think sometimes change is for the good too.
Yeah. Okay. Pretty bold, though, of you to tell FBI HQ, get lost. But nice. Okay. Rob and David, thank you guys so much.